that in the shot? Nope. I look like a Cocker Spaniel. Hey. Hello. My name is Alyssa. What? All right. So today what I'm kind of thinking I want to do is give you a feel for my reading tastes. You don't know me, so it makes it easier for you to get to know me on this channel about books if I talk about the kind of books I like. Follow my logic? What am I trying to say? What am I even talking about? So basically what I've done is kind of like gone through my stats for the year and kind of highlighted like the genres that I read the most of, which I could have told you just based on my understanding of how I read. But I've gone through and like mathematically figured out exactly what I read the most of and kind of nailed down a sort of list of things I typically reach for when it comes to books. So I'm going to go over like the genres I read the most of and then kind of break down specific like tropes or topics or like weird little extra things that I really like in books, which has kind of made it easy for me to pick books I think that I'll enjoy, which I think is why I tend to have a bit higher ratings for books unless I'm like highly disappointed by something, because I, for the most part, think I know what I like. So let's do this thing. So because this is more like my reading taste, I'm not going to go into like how I consume books, like audiobook, ebook, whatever, because that's not so much a taste preference as it is a matter of availability, especially right now. Like I said, this video is not about that, so why are we talking about it? Stay on track. All right, genres. So what I tend to read the most of in general is like the mystery, thriller, horror genre. To break it down a bit further, I'm pretty much half and half between like what you would call a mystery thriller and what you would call a horror. I'm a big fan of horror in general, so that's just, it tends to be what I lean towards when it comes to picking up books or storylines I think would be interesting. I think the genre lends itself to a lot of different topics of conversation, whether it's like grief or family or childhood trauma, all things that I just think are really interesting to kind of get into in a story. Horror kind of allows a lot of those little storylines to be nuanced in a way that I think is really cool. So that's what I read the majority of. For example, this year, of the 94 books that I have read as of this second, 30 of them have been mystery, thriller, horror. So like a third of what I read on average is something in that umbrella of genres. Next, kind of behind that genre at large, is fantasy. I know that the majority of people on the book internet read a lot of fantasy and a lot of YA fantasy, and fantasy as a whole is fairly new to me. So a year and a half ago, I read something like a short little standalone fantasy thing just to kind of give it a try. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is something that I like, or could like if it's done right or whatever. The more I've read over the last year, year and a half has kind of expanded my interest in the genre. It's not as specific an interest as I thought it would be when I kind of started rereading fantasy like a year and a half ago. So as a whole, fantasy is kind of the next largest piece of my genre pie. With, of the 94 books that I've read, 15 of them are fantasy, which as a whole, I guess, isn't a large number, but it's the next largest percentage. Everything else is pretty evenly split between a lot of other genres. This year specifically, I have been gravitating towards other genres or things or formats just to kind of see what else I like. So I have kind of been reading more graphic novels and more sci-fi this year specifically because I wanted to branch out. So my overall numbers are a little bit skewed, but fantasy still kind of sits right under mystery, thriller, horror as my second most read like single genre. So behind fantasy, I don't know that I am classifying this as a specific genre. I like when any kind of story has some kind of like magical realism element. Most of the books that I read that have a touch of magic to them, I would put in a different genre. So it's hard to tell based on like my numbers how many magical realism books I've read this year, because typically I find that magical realism sits more at like a subgenre for a book than what I would classify it as in my like stats spreadsheet. So it's hard for me to have an exact number, but I do like when books have just like a little bit of magic in them. So that I would say is the next like wider topic, though I can't qualify it specifically as a genre just because of how I score my books in a spreadsheet. Oh my God. What am I even talking about? And then lastly, in terms of like big genres that I would say I read a lot of, I do read a lot of nonfiction. I would say that because I've been trying to kind of branch out this year in terms of genres and types of books that I'm reading, my number of nonfiction books has dropped this year compared to any other year. And so far, 9 books of my overall 94 have been nonfiction. It's a strange year to say that I read a lot of nonfiction when it is a smaller number than in the past. It's still the next largest single genre after kind of everything else I've mentioned, but it does seem like a small number for me as opposed to previous years. All right, now that all these genre-specific information is kind of out of the way, let's get into some fun stuff. Let's get into some like specific tropes. The first one that I'll talk about is gonna make me sound basic as hell, but I just can't help it. I really get down for like a dark academia kind of a setting. Who isn't? I love a school setting. I love a dark school setting. Hell yeah. A good example of this isn't new, but one of my favorite books that have this kind of setting is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. There's a lot of conversation about this versus A Secret History. I read this and it blew my mind. I gave it 5 stars. It's one of my favorite books that I read last year, and I hated The Secret History, and that could be my fault, but wow. Loved this. Did not like Secret History. Similarly to like a school setting is like a learning or a training or an academy where you're like honing a specific skill. I like the struggle. I'm a big like, I like to learn. So hearing about other people learning the ins and outs of a magic system or an ability or some kind of training, I love that a lot. Another classic example of this, which like, welcome to the internet, is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, which is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, obviously. This is not my favorite Brandon Sanderson. That is not to say I didn't like it. I thought it was great. I did not think it is his best. What I did absolutely 100% love about this is that our main character has to learn how to use her abilities, magic, whatever. It's not something that comes super naturally to her. There's a lot of figuring it out and a lot of trial and error, and that is something that I think is done really well in here, and that's something that I really look for in a book. Another like trope that I really like is when there's like a magic competition. I know the Night Circus has this, but I actually haven't read the Night Circus yet. It's on the docket for the next few weeks just because this round of Buzzwordathon is the word night, and because I haven't read it, I figured let's throw it on there. But I'm filming this before I will get around to it. So at this point, I have not read The Night Circus, but I'm looking forward to it because of that specific element of the story. But one that I have read that I love, mainly because of the magical competition element, is An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. Now, when I said I read a fantasy book that really made me think, wow, I think I like this genre, this is the one I was talking about. I read this like a year and a half ago. It was my first like foray back into like a fantasy type book, and I thought it's urban fantasy, so maybe that'll be more what I'm looking for than like a full-on high fantasy. Cannot recommend this enough. Absolutely loved it. The ending was like only just a little bit disappointing, but as a whole, this book was so good. But there's like a full on, like over the top magical competition, like show of strength kind of thing. And it was so cool. So I'm always looking for stuff that kind of has that going on. My absolute favorite thing in books is like the repeated day trope. I like literally, if you tell me, like there's a book that I just got called The First 15 Lives of Harry August. I literally bought this because it said the first 15 lives. So I'm like, okay, so living the same thing. That's the reason I bought this book. It is my absolute number one favorite thing in a book. I feel like there is so much you can do with it. I feel like it makes for a really interesting story. It makes for a really unique story because you only have so much time to tell a story. So everything else has to kind of be enhanced or whatever. I love it. Like, it's my absolute favorite thing. One of my all-time favorite books, like literally one of my 2 favorite books ever, is The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. This is the UK version, so it's the 7 deaths, but you get it. This is my favorite book ever. I literally cannot stop talking about this book. I have shoved it down everybody's throat. I have made everybody read it. When this first came out, I don't even have a hardback of the US version anymore because when this book came out, I read it pretty quickly after its release and I bought like 10 copies and I just gave them to people. I was like, read this book, read this book, read this book. I no longer have my US hardcover because somebody in the world has it. But basically, I'm sure you've heard of this. It involves our main character, who remains unnamed for a little while because he has to solve the murder of Evelyn Hardcastle, which happens every single night, and he has 8 days to do it. Each day he wakes up in the body of a different host at this like manor party, and he has to use the different vantage points of all 8 hosts to solve her murder. And if it doesn't get solved by the 8th day, he goes back to the beginning and has to start all over again. So it's like this constant loop of this constant day and just taking that one day and seeing how much you can do within it. This book is so good. I love it for a lot of reasons. Something that was solidified for me in reading this is that I love a repeated day kind of a book. Another thing I think is really fun is when there's like a book within a book. So whether it's that a fictional story is a part of the universe or the narrative for the fictional story you're reading. Did that make sense? Basically, whether there's like a fictional story as the subject for the book, like in Neverworld Wake, where there is a fictional story that is a key factor in the construction of the world. What? If you've read this book, hopefully you understand what I'm talking about. Also, repeated day trope. Or whether there's a literal book within a book, like you're reading 2 books, like in Home Before Dark. Actually, I kind of think he does this a little bit in Lock Every Door as well, now that I think about it. Strangely enough, and this goes against everything I've been saying, didn't care for this, didn't care for Lock Every Door. I don't think I like Riley Sager. We may have to investigate. But essentially, this book specifically alternates chapters within like the book that you're reading, Home Before Dark, and the book that this book is about. You've read this. You had to have read this. It's Riley Sager. Everyone is into Riley Sager. Beats me. But basically, whether you're getting information about the fictional story that the book is about, or you're getting the actual fictional story that the book is about, I'm a big fan of that method of storytelling. I also really like when a book focuses on a family. Found family is great, and I do love that, but I'm talking like actual legit like family, like mothers, fathers, aunts. Like I like a family structure. I like complicated family structure, but I really like when a family is like really super tight and that's the story you're getting. There are so many examples of this that it's hard to like give one, but a book that I liked specifically for the family structure above everything else was actually The Raven Boys. I just read this book and I liked it more than I thought I would. I read this because my sister basically picked it for me. I have all my thoughts in my wrap up. I really didn't care about the main storyline, like with the boys and the king and whatever. Like, it just doesn't, they could be literally doing anything and it wouldn't matter to me. What I loved about this book was Blue's family. I love getting the family structure. I love how tight they are. I love just like the way that they interact with each other. I loved every time we talked about Blue's family. Like I said, there are a ton of examples of like a family in a book, but I just mean there's sometimes where that is really why I'm reading the book. The next thing I want to talk about is specific to fantasy. I love a heavily political fantasy. I don't really want to read about politics in normal fiction, but I do love a fantasy that is like set in the middle of or on the brink of a war. I love how high the stakes are. I love how much is on the line. I love how involved everyone has to be because you're typically following people that are kind of at the epicenter of everything. And I love how tense the build up to war or the prospect of war or whatever is in a fantasy. An example of this is my favorite Brandon Sanderson, which has been Warbreaker. This is a perfect book. I loved everything about this, but mainly I loved following these people who are thrown in to the brink of war and how everyone's trying. I wish I knew what I was saying. That'd be cool. And everyone kind of has to try in their own way to either further that or put a stop to it or save themselves or save someone they love. I loved how much this story focused on the politics. There's nothing I didn't love about this. I thought it was perfection, but oh my God, I've just lost it. Scenes that I thought I would be bored in when they're talking about war and the court politics and everything, I was so invested. I love politics and fantasy. Thanks, Brandon Sanderson. Another like storytelling mechanism that I really like is when there's split timelines. Again, this is covered in a lot of different books, but I love like a then and now story. The example of this that I would like to touch on is The Girl Before by Rena Olson. Please don't mind this. It's so disgusting. I really don't know how to fix it. I've tried everything. The Girl Before by Rena Olson is basically a story about a girl who grows up. You know what? I don't want to say too much about it. It is a story of a woman who gets pulled from her family and then is now being investigated by the police, and she's kind of having to backtrack and is realizing that like not everything is as it seems. This book is beautiful. But in this book, it's told in the present day, obviously, but then it kind of backtracks to her growing up and kind of how that specific event is unfolding now. And I just think it's so successful in the way that it tells the story. It really gives you a full, like, well-rounded view of the character. And I think that's something that a lot of books that have the two timelines tend to do, because you get not only what they're going through now, what they're thinking now, and how it applies to the now, but where that kind of came from without having to do a lot of, like, explanation. You just kind of see it at the start and currently. Oh my God, incredible. The last like trope specific thing that I will get into, and I guess I don't even really know if this is a trope, but I love a retelling, whether that's a classic or like a mythological retelling. I love hearing a story that I am familiar with told in a new way and kind of the same themes applied to a different situation. There are, again, so many books that kind of do this and do it well, but the one I want to talk about is Circe by Madeline Miller. I don't even know if you could classify this as a retelling because it's just a telling, but I think it does it in a very human and heartbreaking and emotional way that's not so much just straight myth retelling. Her story kind of crosses paths with other gods and goddesses of stories that we're a bit more familiar with, so it is a retelling of their stories from Circe's point of view. God, beautiful. Can't recommend this one enough either. These are books I like, so they're obviously in this video. Some other random like one-off things that I enjoy. I love to cry. Give me any sad book. A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. Cried a lot. I also really like when a book kind of delves into grief and the effects of grief on not only the person grieving but everyone around them. Love when books kind of get into that specific. I also love weird shit. I've read a lot of like really weird books, and maybe I'll go into like specifically these are the weirdest books I've ever read, but I love weird. I really like Neil Gaiman a lot, and I know he's not for everybody, but I really like the way that he will tell a story that's almost just a story, but there's something a little bit weird to it that makes it, I mean, I guess you could call that like a magical realism kind of thing, or really light urban fantasy, but I just like how it's a little bit weird. A book that is far from a little bit weird is Bunny by Mona Awad. This is one of the weirdest books I've ever read. I literally felt like I was losing my mind when I read this book. Highly recommend. I also, and this is a very divisive one, I am a fan of really stylized writing. Again, with Neil Gaiman. It's just like a very specific writing style that is not going to work for everybody. I know that N.K. Jemisin kind of falls into this category as well. I just think if you can kind of get a story across, but tell it really interestingly or in a unique way or with words that I wouldn't have thought to use. I just really like when a book makes me think or makes me work. Again, Helen Oyeyemi is a great example of this. I have to work really hard at her books because of her writing style, and it's just so rewarding. I really am a big fan. Specifically, This Is How You Lose the Time War. This has been another one that's very divisive for people. This book like reset everything for me. I loved this so much, and it's very flowery writing, which I think is perfect for a book that is about nature the way that this is. I just loved this. I loved this, and I loved it because of the writing style. This book made me feel like I had something to say. I've never felt like I wanted to write a book in my life, but this book made me feel like, wow, I just want to put something out into the universe with words, because this was that good. I also really love a fucked up book. See Bunny by Mona Awad. So any book that's like, oh my God, ouch, love that. I also am a very character-driven reader. I'm not a big plot person. Well, I mean, I would like for there to be some plot, but I could read a book that has no plot, but really gets into the characters. But I do not want to read a book that has a lot of plot and no character development. I need super fleshed out characters to enjoy a book. I'm trying to think of an exception to that, but I really don't think that there is one. I love books about characters. So to kind of even this out here, as a Libra, I want things to be balanced. Let's even this out here and talk about some stuff I just don't like, because that's fun. Something I flat out hate in books, like I'm not even gonna pretend like there's any exception to this. I hate when authors create a character, because this was your choice. You could have done this differently or better or whatever. I just don't think there's a good way to do this. I hate when authors make their women main characters out of control. I read The Girl on the Train like when it was a big deal when it came out, and I hated it because I hated having to see this story through our main character's perspective. I hate that they made her a helpless, crazy, strung out woman, even for the purpose of the plot. Again, I'm a character-driven reader. I could care less about the plot if the characters are done well. If your characters are done poorly, I don't care about your plot, even if it's great. So I hate when women are painted as out of control in any capacity. I'm not saying there's never a reason for it or women aren't like that. I'm just saying I don't want to read it. I just don't like it. Another example of this beyond The Girl on the Train is The Wife Between Us by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen. I have a very complicated relationship with this author duo. And by very complicated, I mean I've hated two of their books and really liked one of them. I really liked An Anonymous Girl just because I really liked the psychology and the test and whatever. I don't really care for the domestic thriller part of it, but I like the psychology aspect of that book, so I ended up enjoying it. This book, like I said, understand the purpose of the out of control woman character. I don't care. I don't care that it was part of the I don't care. I don't care at all. I hated it. I don't want to read about it. And there has never been an exception. Another thing I tend to not like, and this is a sometimes thing, but I tend to not like YA. I don't want people to be mad at me, but I like what I like. So I just find that whenever, usually, I read a YA book, I find that there's like something missing. Like something could have been more or fuller or bigger. I just feel like there's always something missing when I read YA. I know that that's going to maybe not piss people off, but people are going to feel the need to say something about that. And I'm not saying I've never liked it. Some examples of YA specific books that I actually have really liked are the Truly Devious series. I actually loved this. The first book felt very heavy on the Y portion of the YA. I think the next two books did a really good job of taking all the things that were good from the story and the mystery and the characters and kind of leaving behind the little YA tropes in the first book. It's not my favorite thing I've ever read, but I did really like them, and they are YA. Another example, again, this is really gonna make me sound like I just do whatever the internet tells me, but another example of something I really enjoyed, that was YA, is the Folk of the Air trilogy. Now listen up. I was prepared to not like this. Hardcore. I really loved it. I really loved the characters. I really loved the world. I really loved the magic. I really loved everything. I really, 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 really loved this. So I feel like because of the brutality of this story, this kind of leaned more towards the A in YA. I feel like it's definitely a YA book. I can feel that 100%. However, I feel like it does more. I don't know. I really like this. I don't want to justify myself. I liked this and it's YA. Okay. So I'm going to say this and it's going to sound like I'm lying. I don't think I like historical fiction. It is the genre that appeals to me the least. I just don't think I care. However, every historical fiction book that I have read, I have loved. Now hear me out. I don't read a lot of historical fiction. So if you can get me to read a historical fiction, it's because it is so hyped up. It's because everyone is talking about it. It's because everyone has said, hey, Alyssa, you specifically should read this book. So maybe it's just that I'm getting the really good ones or the ones that I think would appeal to me a little bit more, because it does take a lot for me to actually jump the hurdle and read them. But I mean, historically speaking, every one I've read has been a 4 or a 5-star book, and it's something that I still think about to this day. So I really don't know what to make of that. It's still just something I'm not really interested in, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. One of those books is City of Thieves. I'm not the first person to read this book or recommend it, but oh my god, this book was so good. Another thing I tend to not like is like an isolation survival kind of story. Though you know what, as I'm thinking about it, it seems like I would really like that, because in an isolated environment, you're gonna have to get more from the characters, otherwise the story isn't gonna go anywhere. Oh my god, maybe I'm wrong. We will absolutely have to do more work on that to figure that out. I was gonna give an example of one I really liked, which is No Exit by Taylor Adams. Oh my god. This book is one of my favorite books that I read last year. I downed this book. Read it in literally like 3 hours. Like I just opened it and then never stopped. But now I'm feeling like, should I even mention? Yeah, you know, I'm gonna mention it because read it. But maybe I'm wrong and I would really like that. All right, moving on. The last thing I want to talk about that I don't like in books, again, sound off, fight me, whatever. I don't like romance in books. I just mostly find it makes me uncomfortable and it's weird and I just don't know what to make of it and whatever. Overall, I don't read the romance genre very much, and I don't like reading about the romance plotline in any other book. There obviously have been exceptions to this, like obviously, but one that I think I want to mention, because this ticks a lot of other boxes for things I both like and dislike. This book is just kind of, it did everything for me. It's The Lovely War by Julie Berry. This book is again like the This Is How You Lose the Time War, where it just reset things for me. I was just like, who am I now that I've read this book? This book made me sob, like ugly cry. Wednesday, stop it. This book is heavy on the romance. It's about romance. It's about two couples. Beautiful, incredible. It's historical fiction. It has mythological stuff going on. It's told from the perspective of the Greek gods who kind of had a hand in the events of this book and the war and the romance and everything. Incredible. This book, I think, is even marketed as YA. I don't know that I would really hardcore classify it as adult, but I don't know that I would have called it YA either. I don't know. I just really loved this book. This book did it all. All right, so kind of to sum up, I say this stuff like it's gospel, but clearly I am nothing if not inconsistent. There are always exceptions. That being said, I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on what I reach for in a book and what I kind of stay away from, with some outliers in every category. So to sum up, I think I know what I like, but I guess I'm not really sure after having talked this all through. If you want to recommend me something based on these things I like and don't like, feel free. Love when people tell me what to do. If you want to recommend something that goes against the grain, where you're thinking, I know you said you don't like this, but you haven't tried this, also go for it. I love a challenge. I think that's pretty much all I have to say about that. See you next time. Peace out.